Yeah.
All right, welcome everyone to the Agile Austin Agile at Scale meetup for July 2024. We'll go through a few slides and then we'll hand it over to Paul and get started on our topic. So Agile Austin, our mission, connecting people and fostering that professional growth through collaborative events and educating our community on better ways to deliver value through Agile values, principles, and practices. So that's Agile Austin is a 501c6 nonprofit organization. So letting you know a little bit. We do have board members, and so this is the 2024-2025 board members. A few new faces. Ben, who's with us here today on this call, he's the co-host of this one as well. Ben is a returning CTO for the board. So Ben can answer any questions you might have about that, but we're always looking for volunteers. So it is a volunteer-run organization. So anybody interested, please reach out, and we'll find ways where you can volunteer and can help out in the community. We do have sponsors. Our platinum sponsors, Agile Velocity, has been our platinum sponsor for a good long time. So Agile Velocity does a lot for us. But in the pre-COVID days when we met, they hosted a lot of our places as well. But Agile Velocity, Ed Miller, the coaching. So if you're looking for help, two great ones to look for. You can, for Agile Velocity, they do a lot of training. And so using the code Agile Austin, you can get a discount on any public workshops. I've got stuff blocking my screen here. And so Agile Velocity is from there. We are always looking for other sponsors. Obviously, we can't do this without supportive sponsors. We do have, minimal amount of bills to pay, but we have some to pay, hosting Zoom and other things like that. So we're always looking for those sponsors. Membership, the yearly membership fee is only $35. It's been $35. I don't know, from the beginning, maybe for a very long time at least. So it still hasn't gone up. And so you get a lot of access to there's a Slack channel with the member portal, so you can get out there and post. You can sit on the board and sometimes get special events and other training discounts as well for being a member. So it's not a big commitment as far as being a member, but it does help us also with those expenses. And then you get some benefit. The Slack channel, it sometimes gets busy. People do post jobs on it as well, so it's a great place to go and have discussions with others in the community. We have our meetup page, probably where you saw this. If you didn't, highly encourage that. So the meetup page is where all the meetings that we have, meetups happen. There are 7,000 plus members on that meetup page that get notified when we post things out there. So it does go to a fairly large group. We have the 6 different meetups that you see here, the Agile Coaching, Agile at Scale, the one that we have here, the book club. Our newest one is the product and AI SIG. We've had product before. They kind of come and go, different SIGs come and go. We had product before and they restarted product and around the same time and added AI with it. So it's a great meetup to hear more about that. The leader SIG could be our longest running SIG. Max has been doing that one for probably about 10 years or now. That was actually how I first got into the Agile Austin community, was actually speaking at the Leader SIG. Was one of my first public speaking appearances as well, before we started the Agile at Scale SIG. And then we also have the Lean Kanban SIG that happens as well. A lot of these happen on, like the Leader SIG will happen, I believe, the first Friday of each month. The Lean Kanban is the second Friday, I think, of each month, and Agile at Scale is the third Friday of each month. Don't know exact dates of the other. The book clubs are like on a Thursday. The first and third Thursdays of most months, and so you can see it inside of there. So look forward to any of those. They're very active. A lot of different topics. So great place to learn and around the Agile topics or any kind of engineering topics. I'm gonna hand this one over to Ben, and he can talk a little bit about this one.
Yeah, I'll be very brief here, but one of the member benefits that we recently came up with, the Agile Austin board approved a scholarship for professional development for any of our members to apply for. So I'll post the link here in the chat, and I'll also post it back on the meetup page after this presentation. But essentially, we understand it's been a very tough time in the tech community. People are out there searching for jobs. And so we want to support our community as much as possible. And so we've come up with a scholarship concept, and you can get in touch with the board at agileaustin.org if you have any questions about it. But that form should also help answer any questions you have. It is for our membership, Agile Austin members only at this point. But yeah, just send questions to board at agileaustin.org if you have any, and look forward to seeing some applications. Back to you, Leland.
All right, thanks, Ben. Agile at Scale. This meetup has been going since 2016. Ben joined me as the co-lead in 2020, and so we try to hit a variety of topics. We're always interested in what you're wanting to learn more about. So feel free to connect with me or Ben. Or message me on here as well, however you want to connect to us, but connect to us. And what are the topics, or if you're looking, or if you're wanting to speak about a topic, always interested in helping others get their message out. We're always looking for speakers. We're always looking for topics. So it's not always us coming up with the topics. We can help find the speakers, but let us know what you're interested in learning, and we'll be glad to try to put those on the list and look for those topics in the future. Upcoming events, we have 3 speakers. I don't know the exact topic. Trying to remember what Carrie and I had talked about. I'll actually see Carrie next week at the Agile 2024 conference. So I know she's going and I'm going, so I'm going to find some time with her, and we'll narrow that down and get the meetup posted. So you'll see that real soon. Jennifer is going to be talking about risk and regulatory in an agile world. So what do you do if you're like financial services and you're highly regulated? How some of that works inside of it. We'll get the exact details coming soon. And then Jill will be following up probably something in the product space inside of it. And so those we at least have the speakers, and I will get the topics posted very soon. But today we have Paul Givens here. Paul's going to talk about contract-based development, how it helps scale, how it hinders scale. And so with that, we're going to hand it over to Paul and let him take over the sharing.
Great. Thanks, Leland. Give you a little bit of an introduction to myself. My name is Paul Given. I'm a principal with CapTech Consulting. I've been doing Agile software development since, I don't know, if anybody knows Bill Wake was one of my first partners in doing software development. So as long as Bill Wake's been doing it, I've been doing it. Learned a lot from him. So probably I'll call it the late 90s. We were actually putting in Scrum and really putting in iterative development. So I have all the certifications. I'm SBCs, CSM, all this stuff. I've had those for a long time. I try to keep up with them. I don't necessarily do as much as I should. But at CapTech Ventures, I lead our financial services practice. I also am the sponsor for our product and Agile practices, but I typically take those talents and apply them in financial services is where I focus most of my work. What I'd like to talk to you about today is contract-based development. And can you guys hear me okay? I've got some background noise. I hope it's okay. I just want to make sure, contractors show up, contract-based development. Well, contractors show up at any time and just start working, right? So there's maybe a tighter contract that's required. So anyway, the idea is we're talking about contract-based development. So before I get started and explain anything, let's talk about what contract-based development is. And when I say contract-based development, I really mean that there's a contract for an exchange of information or an exchange of a provision of information and maybe a transaction that happens, et cetera. And those contracts usually are manifested in what we know as REST APIs. Is everybody familiar with API-driven development? Right. So in today's financial services world, especially, but in most places, right? When they talk about modernizing your technology, taking legacy systems or monolithic systems, they typically break them up into a series of services that are either represented. Those services, that those capabilities are represented as a series of APIs, or even a set of microservices where you go get stuff together. Each of those APIs and those microservices represents a contract. The idea that if you provide me with this information, I will either provide you back with what you are requesting, right, with a certain set of information, or I will take care of some sort of action for you. And then I will give you confirmation of that action happening, or I'll give you an error that says, hey, I wasn't able to do that. Or I'll give you an error that says you provided me the wrong information. So all of those are things that we're talking about, are terms of the contract. So when you have contract-based development, you have to first figure out what. I'm asking you guys the question.
What the response is of the system of record.
Yeah. What the response is, likely from a system of record. So, for example, everybody probably uses mobile banking, right? And the idea is when you go to look, when you click on your account in mobile banking, there's an API call that happens, and it says, okay, I'm going to give you a list of transactions, and there's contract terms associated with that, right? I'm going to provide it back to either some orchestration layer or the mobile app itself, and it's going to say, let me consume those X number of transactions. That X number is usually part of the contract. Usually another part of that contract is an indicator that, hey, there are more transactions that you can load. And there's usually a max number that you can request for or page for. It's like, and then there might even be a part of that contract is that I'm going to cache a certain number of transactions so that if you want to dive deeper into the list of transactions, I will be able to provide you a faster response time. So there's lots of secondary implications to this types of contracts. So when you start to develop modern systems like this, right, where, okay, so now that API that says, I'm going to go get this list of transactions and do all of this work, right, it's probably making a call to some host system somewhere, which is usually on a mainframe. And guess what? That mainframe isn't really designed to provide information real time. It's a batch-based system. So, well, maybe then really what's happening is there's a microservice that sits in front of that actually streams the data to an operational data store that continually refreshes its responses. So there's an interim layer of data there and how it all works. The architecture gets very complicated very quickly. But in the end, what you can do is what a lot of banks have done is they've ring-fenced their core systems with these kind of contracts and these APIs. And guess what that lets them do? They can now modernize those systems behind those walls, behind those contracts. As long as they're paying attention and supporting the contracted interaction, they can make improvements to their core systems. They can modernize them. They can lower their cost of operations. They can do a whole bunch of work. So there's a construct here of getting this set of interactions set up and these contracts set up that allow you to do work behind the scenes, so to speak, as long as you are keeping up with your contract. There's a really big benefit to that. So first, I'm going to say that's kind of my view on why you have contract-based development and why you have contract-based architecture, and why firms would be interested in it. People have questions about kind of what that means. We'll start there. People have experience with this. Working with teams now that are developing APIs or microservices. I mean, Ben's a CTO. He has to do that. He doesn't have a choice.
Yeah, I can say at least the organization I work in and previous ones, definitely we have these issues. And yes, we are, well, I don't want to say on the recording how
that's fine.
how many issues we have, but yes, there are issues because contracts are not necessarily followed. And I guess my question would be, if you wanted to like use a real world analogy of what's trying to be done, because this is kind of software contract. I'm sure you've got one, but would like a highway, in construction and, essentially diversion of roads, like maybe that might be a good analogy for what's happening in the physical world to what you're talking about.
Right. So the idea is, hey, I get on this superhighway, right? And I've kind of entered a contract that it's going to get me where I'm going at a particular speed, et cetera. Now, if you while they're doing construction on that highway to make it better, right, they're usually going to divert you to another road. And they're going to try and keep it as high speed as possible. You know that never works, right? So things slow down, things happen, right? So that contract isn't really kept. It's like, yeah, we're going to build a new bridge. So we'll combine everybody down into one bridge, and that's going to slow everything down. But you'll still be able to get where you need to go at a relatively higher speed than you would if you had to like drive north 50 miles, go across a different bridge. So that's the idea of the refactoring behind the contract. The contracts tend to get impacted some way, shape, or form, or the typical performance tends to get impacted in some way, shape, or form. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to go through an example of kind of what's an emerging kind of contract-based development trend in the insurance industry. We call it workplace benefits, but let me share my screen here. I'm going to figure out how to do this. Share screen. Share, and then I have to say okay like 28 times, or is it? Okay, you can see my screen now, right? So this is a mural board. It's very rudimentary. I'm not an artist. I'm not a good guy, but the idea of in the insurance industry. So if you think about when you enroll in benefits for the company you work for, right? You enroll in things like long-term disability. You enroll in vision insurance. You enroll in healthcare. You enroll in dental insurance. You enroll in lots of different coverages or lots of different benefits that your company can provide to you, either at a cost or part of your benefits package. Those benefits are usually administered by a company or your HR department, and they become a benefit administration organization. So for example, if you use Workday, right? Workday has some benefit administration capabilities on the back end that enable your HR department to register you for these benefits with the benefits provider, right? So there's a benefit plan. There's an evidence of plan or insurance, insurability that every person in that company has to go through, or you have to go through as a group. And then you actually have to enroll, your company actually has to enroll you in those benefits and basically set you up on a policy system, some sort of policy system or some sort of benefits management system. So a good example of this, I always use this case. I don't know whether people like it or not. It's like accidental death and dismemberment. How many people have that coverage with your some people think it's kind of a eerie subject, but you get it, right? And it's relatively cheap, but it's pretty good to have, right? So it's pretty good for your family members anyway. Or hey, not many people are in jobs. Some people are in jobs where real accidents happen, right? I travel a lot actually, and I've gotten hurt traveling. I didn't pull on the accidental deaths and dismemberment, but it was an accident that happened while I was traveling, and it was like, okay, wait a minute, that happened during work. We have to figure this out. But the idea of being able to, today, a lot of that process is manual. I've got a whole list of people, and as a benefit admin, guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to take that list of people and I'm going to go to different providers. I'm going to go to Mutual of Omaha. I'm going to go to TIA CREF. They do some of this work. There's Delta Dental does a whole bunch of stuff. While they say they're dental, they actually offer a whole bunch of other kind of benefits. There's lots of benefits providers out there. They're usually insurance companies or some sort of benefit provider that basically makes money on annuities. So the idea is that they send this list to people, and they get a quote back. Say, we can give you this benefit for this amount per member. And then once they say yes, right, you've got to go through this kind of plan configuration. So the plan has, for this company, it looks like this, and this is what it looks like. So having a benefit admin submit all those members and get through that plan configuration of I'm going to create a plan, and here are the benefits that these members should get, and here's how it works, et cetera, right, is an API call. There are API calls being developed to do this. And there's a group called LIMRA out there that's developing these API standards. So you can have a common set of exchanges between benefit admins and benefit providers. Now, these benefit providers haven't really done a lot of this external API development for a long time, forever, really. So they're figuring this out and they're working through some stuff. So they're just starting to develop these APIs, and they have these kind of, what are in the LIMRA standards, there's these kind of definition of, we call them experience APIs. So there should be a set of APIs for plan configuration. There's a set of APIs predefined for evidence of insurability, and there's a set of APIs predefined for benefits enrollments. So there is a third party that has actually developed the contract, the API interface specifications for benefit admins to talk to benefit providers. So there's a nice way for a group has gotten together and said, hey, here's a standard interface for you to use, and here's how everything should work. So guess what? There's a contract there. There's an implied contract there. What does that mean? That means that if we have an implied contract, we should be able to do development simultaneously. The Ben admins, right, should be able to say, well, guess what? I know what the contract is. I know what the responses are going to be and everything else. I can start to develop my software to create the posts and interpret the responses. I can start to work behind the scenes, and so that I can consume those APIs and get the responses I necessarily have. And at the same time, the benefits provider should say, all right, we now understand how to do that same work. So they're working simultaneously on either side of the contract. What do we do to test? Do we wait till everybody's done? Ben's shaking his head no. What do other people think? Well, there's a neat thing called service virtualization, where you can essentially stub out your interpretation of that contract. You can stand it up, people can call it, and you provide back fake data. There are tools out there called service virtualization, so that if you took a benefits provider, they could actually stand up an experience API on plan configuration and say, here's our interface, here's what it looks like. Feel free to work and test against that. Guess what that does? That allows them to take those posts where people are testing against that and use them as live data for their own software development. So much like the road who says, hey, I'm going to give you this contract to get the cars through the road, but now I'm going to be making a change. Well, I'm going to allow your car to flow through while I'm working on something else. And I can see that traffic that's going on. So I can figure out, knowing that traffic that's going on and everything else, I can figure out how I need to adjust the road. So you can kind of work simultaneously while that's happening. So to initiate work, you can stand up and stub. You can stub out an API essentially using service virtualization, and you can work simultaneously. Now, as an Agilist, right? How does that make you feel, right? If you're talking about minimizing work in progress and getting to working software, how do you balance those two things in this scenario? That's the challenge, right? I've got work going on in two places, and that's a lot of work in progress against a pretty big thing. And I don't necessarily know if I'm making progress or not, because I got two different organizations doing it. So that's a risk associated with contract development, is that WIP seems to grow. Hey, we got this great thing, this great tool, it's called service virtualization. We can go off and work on our own. And as long as we're paying attention to the contract, then we should be okay. But, hey, well, we got a question. Good. Max.
Hey, Paul. Thanks for sharing this. Very interesting. There's one particular part of this that I'm scratching my head saying, oh my goodness, I've been in these scenarios where a very detailed contract was put together, everything was understood, but when they put the contract together, they really didn't understand what they needed or they would want. And then as the power I see in like an iterative style development is that you get continuous feedback loops. So that concept of, hey, you gave me this contract, I delivered exactly what you wanted in this contract, but oops, it wasn't really what you needed. Well, that's not my fault. That's what was in the contract. And so you get the gist, right? Like this is like that red flag that I see. How can that be addressed or a bit better?
That's a great question, Max. And that's actually the question I was hoping I would get somebody to ask. Is that you got all this WIP going on. What happens when somebody needs the contract changed, right? It's like, well, wait a minute. Through my testing and development, I've realized I need another field, or I need this, or I need an interim response. What does that look like, right? So, you kind of look over this space and, this is what we're saying is this is what it looks like. I've got my whip activity is I have one company doing development against a contract, right? And this contract is pretty standard. And then inside of the benefit provider, I probably have a whole bunch of teams doing work, and they have their own internal contracts that they're working on. It's like, wow, we've got a contract to fulfill on a contract to fulfill on a contract. And these contracts can essentially, what's the word I'm looking for? It's like there's a domino effect. Hey, one contract needs to be changed. That means this needs to be changed. That means this needs to be changed. So there's a domino
Cascade.
effect. Yeah, cascade. Thank you, Logan. That's fantastic. That's the word I'm looking for. Getting too old to remember any simple words like cascade. So, you've got a lot of considerations here, right? So if you're just doing this to start with, you probably max, if you're just starting out, right? It's like, hey, you can set up a simple contract and say, we know this is going to evolve. And you do what any other scaled Agile set of teams does. You communicate regularly about, well, let's create some integration. So you've got a virtualized service. Okay. Are you guys able to consume it? Are we able to provide to it? Well, maybe we need to then create a live test as fast as possible to validate that when you get the same result from us in, quote, a test bed that you get out of a virtualized service. Is that right? And then you also create a mechanism to request changes, right? And that mechanism to request changes is actually, interestingly enough, it's a source code repository. So if you actually look at, your team topologies here, right? There's two different team topologies that that a benefit provider could put in place. They could have one team that works across all of their infrastructure. So they're managing their contracts internal to the team. Likely they're going to figure that stuff out. And as long as they're paying attention to this contract and understanding it, they can work within that team. And that works okay, because within a team, you can usually communicate pretty well. But when you really have some, like, I'll call it spread out expertise, and you really need to create multiple teams across this because you're doing multiple things all at once, and you've got a lot more work in progress. You have the same amount of work, but it's being done across many, many different teams. So you have a plan configuration process team, and then you have different core systems teams that are providing different microservices, which are their own set of contracts, right? They have to figure that out. So the construct that we've put in place at a lot of places is what we call a contract repository. Here's the contract. Here's how it works. Hey, consuming team, right? There's two different ways to do this. Hey, consuming team, you can pull from this repository. You can take the contract. You can actually stand up a virtualized service out of this repository, and you can build that into your pipeline so that anytime there's a contract update, you now can get an automatically updated virtualized service and you can work with it. Not only that, because you subscribe to that contract repository, you're going to get a notice when somebody does a branch. Somebody is out there thinking about changing the contract. So people can notify each other across boundaries very simply and say, hey, this is what it's going to work. And the very first place that this always comes up is the first time a contract needs to change. It's like, well, how do we know? Why did you deploy an updated API without telling us? I was like, well, we just needed, we needed a more robust, response time or whatever. We were trying to meet the intent of the contract. Well, let's go ahead and create a mechanism for communication. And it's a really simple tool to be able to do that, is that contract repository.
Hey,
So
Paul, sorry, real quick. Can you expand the Miro so we can see it? It's a little tough to see.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, thanks.
So the idea is I just have two different team topologies here. Whether you have one team that's working across that benefit provider stack that's out managing basically a process API, so an API that listens to the external API and then calls a bunch of microservices to be able to create the response, or you have a team that's really focused on that experience, the process API, and they're working with other teams to create those microservices and consume them. So this is the contracts between teams is the more typical implementation, given the history of the insurance industry and the financial service industry of, I've got all these different core systems and I need to coordinate requests across them. So how do I do that? Today, it's usually done by batch processing. I'm going to set up records in this batch file, then this batch file, then this batch file, and they're all going to run, and there's this great big orchestration overnight, so everything happens. Well, if somebody needs to enroll today, and they need to be able to, one of the best customer experiences I can think of is like, I need to enroll in death and dismemberment benefits today because I started a new job and it's a dangerous job. I don't want I don't want to wait for my enrollment to happen until overnight because I got to start the job today. Think about it. If he starts the job today and he's not enrolled, guess what? He's not covered. So we have to figure out how to make this real time. And one way to make these batch systems real time is to kind of create these microservices that can inject single records and work through it. You know how this works in the airline industry, or how it has worked in the airline industry in the past? Is those microservices, guess what they did? They took requests and they screen scraped information out of the airline reservation systems and poked information into the airline reservation systems. Still using screen scraping, but guess what? It was near real time, and it actually, you can get near real time responses, and it actually worked. And that allowed the airlines to actually work beneath those microservices to make their systems more accessible. So this is happening in the insurance industry today, the benefit provider industry today. So the idea is there's two different ways to construct this contract repository. One is that the owner of the contract puts the contract in the repository, and people can subscribe to that contract and find out when those changes are potentially being made. You can communicate changes, you can communicate exactly what the changes are. And then you can start to actually, within that contract, you can start to say, well, I have an implementation of this contract here that will stay alive and working, that we will support for X amount of time while I put the new one in. So you start to have versions of contract in the repository and versions of that represent versions of contracts in production with expiration dates. So the idea of, hey, I've got a road that's going to be open for the next 6 months, but at the end of 6 months, I actually am going to divert all traffic to this other road. Now it should be a bigger, faster road, but if you don't have a vehicle that can make that curve, you need to do something, right? That's probably a bad analogy, but I couldn't come up with how you switch. Trying to stick with with that analogy. But so the idea is that there's a switching cost, but the idea is giving people time to switch, creating that communication is what's necessary. Now, the other benefit to this truly is you can get to truly parallel development if you get good at defining these contracts and you get good at communicating changes to these contracts, and you make those changes as small as possible. People can react and refactor to those changes very, very quickly. Those teams, as they're playing and working as a team, as those contracts get updated, well, guess what? They get fairly synced, so they start to look like one team by leveraging this communication mechanism. And that parallel development that needs to go on to create that one process API response to the experience API can happen very, very quickly. Usually within, you can get everybody working within one sprint, and it might take you another sprint just to make sure and validate that you have everything working. So you've got everything done behind service virtualization. And then guess what? The next sprint is all about, well, the contract's not exactly right. Let's refactor to make sure everything works together so that we basically protect the contract up here with the Ben admin. That's usually the pattern I've seen, and that's the pattern I'm seeing with the current client as we work through, hey, let's get better at this contract development. The other really good thing about contract development is that teams can test their own contracts by creating test harnesses. I'm going to put crazy data through my microservice. I'm going to put crazy data through my API, and I'm going to see what happens. So it enables them to actually protect themselves against people denial of service attacks and all kind of other fun stuff. So you can start to look at non-functional requirements, and you can start to test against those using a test harness with your interface. You can stand up kind of a private capability and run through a whole bunch of different tests. So it allows you to do that testing I would call it in a very safe manner, as well as in a very unimpactful manner, as you can do it off the side and spin stuff up, and it works really, really well. I had alluded to before, being able to pull the virtualized service or some sort of stub into the development of your own pipeline. So if you're actually building your infrastructure out, right, you can build out a piece of infrastructure very quickly that acts like this service so that you can test against it. And then guess what? You tear it down and you're done. You get your results, you tear it down and you're done. You can go on to the next, make adjustments and then spin it up when you need to. So you can pull it right into your development pipelines and get fast feedback to your developers, which is really the key to making sure you're staying in sync with your contracts. So I've talked a lot. The questions I was going to have for you guys is we talk about as an Agilist, right? I always get concerned about work in process. What's the amount of work in process? Do I really have 3 teams working on probably maybe 9 stories simultaneously that need to be cobbled together to create one set of working software for the customer. That sounds risky. What do you guys think? Leland, I'll pick on you because I know you've seen this before.
Sorry. Was multitasking.
All
You
right.
caught me.
I'll pick on you because you're multitasking. How about that?
That works.
Well, yeah, I'll say it does sound, it definitely does sound risky. And I'm kind of wondering, and maybe this is a little off topic, but wanted to get your thoughts on probably the most famous memo surrounding this is Jeff Bezos at Amazon, and all teams will use contracts essentially, or else
Yeah.
you're fine. Do you see similar buy-in at the executive level to help drive these initiatives?
In financial services, where I have most of my experiences, the executives in the bank, one executive, Rich Fairbanks at Capital One, has said, we will be API driven. And we will be API driven. So he didn't say, Jeff, he didn't say you're fired, but he says, we're going to move to become API driven. And oh, by the way, given our background in our ability to leverage data to make better decisions, we're going to basically build that capability into our APIs. So they've done a very, very nice job of exposing insights, exposing data via APIs so that you really don't ever have data contention and all this other fun stuff. And it makes it easier for them to manage their data and how it's used. So like if they find out something that's out of your, hey, here's a piece of data that's out of compliance. Well, guess what? You just shut down a contract. It can create some havoc, but guess what? It's an easy way to manage. So the contracts enable you to, for lack of a better term, respond fairly quickly. It's like, hey, this contract is not a good contract for our company. It's creating its compliance or whatever. So, or those microservices, right? So especially at the microservice level where you're providing maybe 1 or 2 pieces of information so an API can provide a much more robust response. If those pieces of information are questionable and they're not critical, then you can turn them off easily. Just say, oh, it's, I'm gonna make that. You can make your systems that much more resilient, right? So that gets to, the contracts have to get pretty well defined. So to your conversation of it being risky, I think there's an iterative process to get to the final contract. It's like, let's start with a simple API contract. Let's start with a virtualized service that rest for that. And then maybe the first sprint is let's iterate to the contract that we need, that we believe we need now. So what is critical to it? What is not critical to it? How do we work with that? And how does that all happen? That's a very collaborative process. And it might even be pre-work to a larger plan. Max.
Yeah, and this, hold on there. I had my hand up. Hey, Leland, hold up. Paul, you finished there with part of the question I was gonna ask about pre-planning. I've always worked at large enterprises, and before the work or that contract even hits the team, there's been discussion about dependencies. There's been discussion about how this links up to our key priorities, because it's sometimes crazy how low priority work just gets into the backlog, and then they start to work on it. And I'm like, wait, there's like 3 more important things that this team should be doing. Why are they working on this? Who even requested it, right? All this stuff. And it could come in as a contract. All of a sudden you see a contract for the team and you're scratching your head saying, where did this contract come from? So I think that is part of a larger discussion, of course, but all of that kind of has to be in place and very well understood before this contract approach happens, right?
I would agree. I think there's a product component to this, right? If you are the product owner for a team that produces APIs, right, you have to look at the value of your contracts in your market. So the consumers of your API, they could be other companies, they could be other applications, they could be individuals, right? Individuals who might be writing their own apps. It could be something, but there's a product taxonomy that goes along with your team topology that says, well, guess what? I'm the product owner for this microservice. And now I have to understand the lineage of my microservice. Where does it get used? In what way is it presented? So I have to I am now accountable for the data lineage of my microservice as to how it gets used within the enterprise. So guess what you have to do? You have to register with the data stewards to say, this is how my data is getting used, and this is the business definition of my data. So you have to provide that capability. And that goes up into the API product owner who says, well, now guess what? I've got all this data, and I have to make sure that when I use the term, I'll call it available balance, right? When I use the term available balance, or I use the term of, hey, you're eligible for coverage, right? For this particular claim. So eligibility for a claim means that what does that really mean? What does that mean to your customer? What does that mean? What are the key definitions there? So a lot of pre-planning has to happen, but a lot of, if you have a lot of that stuff defined and leveraged and understood by the product owner, that pre-planning can happen fairly quickly. It's like, well, we already have these 5 services. We already have these 2 APIs. We can cobble them together, and it's creating exactly what you want.
Yeah. I mean, the largest pain point a lot of times is when you deal with dependencies. And so you're like, you cannot control every part. You actually have to wait for other people. But that's a whole other story.
And that's, well, Max, that's organizing around value, right? So if you look at the team topology, right? If we have these teams that are trying to build these APIs, right? And you have the core system teams that they're publishing microservices. You eventually want to get to maybe just one team for a certain set of core services that can do all of that work. They're managing the contracts within them. They're managing the business intent, the business definition of the data, the technical definition of the data, and how everything fits together, right? And actually the transaction, if there's an actual transaction occurring in one of those core systems, they're making sure that it's complete and it works appropriately. So a lot of places start here, and they start with managing all of these contracts in such a way, like Amazon, right? But guess what? Amazon's team are super dynamic. People come and pick their own teams, and then they go back and they say, well, what contracts do we have? How do we pick those and pull them together? They have this ecosystem of contract repository that looks at it. And then what they'll do is they'll look at that and they'll say, well, we need to change this one. We need to create a new version. And that spins up a whole bunch of dependent work, right? So they're pretty flexible, and they have a proliferation of contracts, I'd say, that it's going to get them in trouble eventually. They have this massive capability just to publish new things, right? Because they have complete access to unlimited infrastructure. So they have that ability. Most companies don't really have that ability. Even if they're operating in the cloud, there's a bill that comes through for that, right? So if you have like 5 versions of the same API running all at the same time with 5 different applications consuming it, and they're just different versions of it, and they could all move to one, well, there's some consolidation of savings there that they could work that Amazon's not too worried about.
Yep.
Hey, Paul, we have a
Cool.
question in the chat.
Yeah.
Logan had posted it. It creates some havoc, but it's easy to manage. And it said it makes him wonder, where does that work of handling that havoc land? And by where, he means who would manage that havoc.
That's a good question, Logan. I like that question a lot, because the answer is it depends, right? But it depends on how your organization organizes around teams. So if you have a team, a core systems team that's producing microservices, so to speak, somebody has to act as the product owner for that team, for those microservices, right? Typical product owners aren't really thinking about, well, what's the structure of microservice, what's the contract, et cetera. They're thinking about business functionality. You have to have a special person that can basically take the lineage of that microservice and trace it the whole way back up to where the end customer is impacted. That's a special skill. So you may actually end up with a group of technical product leaders that is led by more like a chief product officer or chief product owner for those microservices that understands microservices architecture and capabilities. And the same thing for APIs. So those are the people that manage the havoc, right? They're responsible for keeping this contract repository up, operating clean and lean. And that's a good way to measure progress is, okay, everybody has to publish the contract repository. How messy is it? And chances are, if it's messy, then guess what? Your implementations are messy. So it's a good representation of how messy is it? Do you need to refactor? Do you need to clean up? Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, I think so.
Good.
And a little ways back in the chat, I wanted to get to Shreya's question about won't you do this in a testing environment before releasing to prod? And I guess I'll just add to that, like, I'm interested in your experience in the industries that you're working in. Are a lot of these contracts being worked out in test environments, or
Oh, yeah.
are more mature CI/CD pipelines where you can actually have features in production and toggle them on and off as appropriate?
I'd say, in the insurance industry, they're just they're naturally standing up. So they're naturally just standing these things up. So they're providing test environments, but they're more like, so for example, a benefit provider is providing a test environment, a full test environment that may be stubbed out for some microservices, et cetera, but they're providing it down. They're going down through a level with their test environment so they can provide real responses. So they're virtualizing some of it, but that's only because they can't do that. But when they really go to, hey, Ben admin, we're going to provide you a specific instance of the experience API so we can run our process and stuff at APIs. They're going to basically, when they first stand it up, they're going to say, all right, this is what the production environment is going to look like. Let's run some synthetic transactions through. Let's understand what they are so that we can manage them on both ends. We know it works. Good. We have now a production environment. Guess what they do? They then back down to a test environment. And they figure out where they can stub that out as necessary. They don't necessarily have to be full blown, but they know that they've got something working. So it seems counterintuitive that they would actually start with a production environment, but the idea is you get something working, you don't make it turn it into a production environment, but once you have it working and you're sure of it, now you basically have said, I only produce that environment through automation. Now you have the ability to automate the creation of a test environment or automate the creation of a development environment, and you can manage it from there. And that gives you three levels of pipeline to actually go build your production environment when something needs to change. That's the key point on the second piece, though, is that don't manually configure that production environment. Make sure it's automated as as an environment that's all the infrastructure associated with is automated as part of an infrastructure pipeline, so that you can easily recreate it at a different address or a different instance, and make that a configurable property, so that you can now recreate the same thing as a test environment. So you can kind of back down from it when you initially start. You can go the other way too, but just make sure that your pipelines actually build the environment in an automated fashion. It's not manually created, because otherwise it's going to get messy too quickly.
Yeah. And I think we can also touch on, like, at the beginning of this talk, Regina had mentioned contractors, and I think we can kind of touch on maybe your experience with these teams, because you've talked about, the various different companies that are involved. Are these typically teams that are comprised of full-time employees or contractors? Like, what does the mix look like there?
So we're actually we're working in this manner for one company that's just starting to do this, right? And they have a lot of new hires that they are said, hey, we're going to go hire new talent to do this. They've hired some experts. They've hired some people who are learning, and then they also have their experts in their core systems, and they're bringing those teams together. We're helping them put together and leverage this contract repository service virtualization, and helping them really work through how they organize their teams around value, and which was like, hey, can we do this? They're actually operating with contracts within the team, but they're not doing contract-based development yet. They're just building stuff. And therefore there's drift on their DevOps pipelines, there's drift on their infrastructure and everything else. And they're not really being rigorous about that space. So we're helping them refactor to get back to that rigor, and suggesting that they start this way first, using a contract repository, and then eventually move to more of a single team model as they start to proliferate their APIs for benefit admins. We work with another very mature, very advanced bank that has labor on demand. Essentially, they go to all kind of different companies and they say, here's how we work, this is what we do, and you guys need to just have very, very strong development standards and everything else, but like, it's all API driven, all microservice driven, and they're very strong in how they say you will follow this design. The engineers follow the design almost to a fault, right? Where there could be, the design might actually need to change. Good example there is they're rebuilding. It's a bank. They're rebuilding their core systems to be more real time. And what they've failed to realize in their design is that A lot of financial services are time bound, which creates what? A new date hits, it creates a large batch of work. They're creating this event-based system, and they're overwhelming their event-based system with a large batch of work because so many things were driven by a change from 11:59 p.m. to 12 a.m. All right, well, guess what? You now have 5 million records you need to run through right now, right? And your SLA is that, well, for our event-based stuff, your SLA is 30 seconds. Well, guess what? You're not going to be able to do it unless you actually, spend all that money to ramp up. They have auto scale and everything else. It's going to ramp up, and they're going to spend a lot of money doing that, and it's come down. And, guess what? If it all got done by 10 minutes after, it'd be okay. It doesn't all have to be done within 30 seconds after. So they haven't really thought about that in their design, and they were just taking advantage of auto scaling. It's like, well, wait a minute, you're going to spend a lot of money that you don't need to. So contractors in working in this space, right? They have to, there's, Spring Boot, right? It's really good Java developers who understand Spring Boot can work in this stuff, and they understand it. People who have really good experience with MuleSoft. MuleSoft has tools that help you do all this stuff work and help you coordinate work, etc. If you pay attention to the documentation capabilities they provide, then people can come in and pick up this work pretty quickly. Because what happens is you get very specific in these microservices and the core systems, etc. The requirements get very specific. So you can get the work done without a lot of context, but if you don't know the context at all, you may be building to a blind spot that you just don't realize. And that's a risk that the company has to figure out and balance.
All right, we have one more question in the chat. As a product manager, how can I make a developer's life better in the context of the topic today? What might I be overlooking in the contract of these and microservices?
Where I would start is at your definition of done. Right? So if you have a definition of done for a microservice or an API, does that mean that the contract is registered in the contract repository? Does that mean that the tools to do a pull against that contract repository and include as virtualized service in somebody else's DevOps pipeline, right? Is that part of your definition of done? And is that are you enabling people to leverage the contract as defined and as written and giving them the tools to get fast feedback against that contract? That's where I see a lot of places falling down, is in their definition of done for an API or a new version of an API, et cetera, or even a microservice, right? Is they say, oh yeah, it's done. Go try it. And it's like, there's no registration, there's no final documentation. People can't consume it. And it has to be consumable because it is a product. So think about making it easy to consume and easy to understand as part of your definition of done. I'd be interested if that's helpful or not.
Okay, any other questions? I think we got them all in the chat.
I've got one, but I don't want to monopolize. So if someone has one, I'll give a few seconds here to pipe up. Okay. So my final question,
Yeah.
in terms of frameworks for testing, I know PACT is probably the most famous contract-based testing framework. And maybe you can't get into specifics, but I'm kind of curious what you've seen as frameworks that really work for testing out contracts.
PACT, Postman. I would suggest that, you have a virtualized service. You should have a set of tests that actually validate that virtualized service, and that should be an automated set of tests. I actually think that you can leverage a BDD structure here, where you're basically taking given when then, and you've got this payload, you do this stuff, and this event happens, etc. And then because those you can build upon, and you can build a common library of calls and responses that are leveraging the same nomenclature as the contract. So that, guess what, when the contract changes and you create new nomenclature, you can go examine your tests very quickly and figure out where you might have gaps. So version your tests with, it's like you can use it, kind of anything, but I would make them very driven towards the contract. And then also, if you're writing test automation and there's an API, a RESTful API call, there's, I put this, right? Okay. Put means you're going to basically provide this data, right? And it's got this data. And the other key thing about that, those tests is that if they have to provision information, if you're driving an API kind of end to end with test automation, and those tests need to provision data in those core systems, you need to create that capability, right? So as the benefit provider, right, that's where you have to look at test data management and how you condition your tests to be set up so that you can validate that the API is doing the right thing the whole way through the stack. That capability to provision or condition that data in those core systems becomes critical.
All right, sounds good. And with that, we're right at time. Paul, any last thing, how people can reach out to you if they have other questions or get in contact?
I think, you saw my post on LinkedIn. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn. I will, I'll give you guys a little plug. I'm trying to figure out how I get into chat. I'll stop sharing and that might help. How do I stop sharing? There we go, stop sharing.
Sure.
There we go. And I'll go to chat. Just so you guys know, I mean, Leland said, hey, the industry's not hiring a lot. So CapTech is hiring, right? So if you're listening to this and you're interested in helping companies with this kind of work, et cetera, we'd love to hear from you. So I'll post in the chat our page, so to speak. And you'll see cities listed by the positions. And don't pay attention to this because we hire people everywhere.
And we'll also post this to the meetup page, the link for the hiring, as well as our internal Slack channel as well. And we also got a question if it'd be possible to share the Miro link.
Oh, yes. Let me do that. Here's the Miro link. And we have to password protect it because that's what our conditions are. And the password is Agile. I appreciate you guys spending the time with me today. I hope you found it interesting. I always love to kind of just think okay, if we're going to do this, what are the impacts on our Agile principles? How does it work? Just so we at least know what we're getting into.
Yeah, we didn't see the items in the chat actually.
Oh, they weren't?
I'm pretty sure it wasn't one person.
Sorry. Yeah, I only sent them to Sherry. Sherry, you're special. let me grab them. How do I send them to everybody?
Could be the top choice option, meeting group chat.
Group chat, that's it. Not very good.
Okay, that's
yeah. I think there's 2 links in there. Yeah, so you have to split the links up. Sorry, let me see if I can.
Yeah, we'll get those out to all our members for sure.
That's the board link. All right. Thank you, everybody. Leland, thanks for inviting me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, it was great. Great catching up again. I'm gonna have to make my way out there. Come see you. So
yeah, anybody wants to come to Charlottesville, let me know.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great presentation.
Thanks. Cheers, everybody.
All right, thanks. Cheers.